Well, I am talking about postmodernism as one of the transitional styles from modernism to parametricism, and I understand what it delivered. And initially, it was quite resourceful. I mean, it was trying to make architecture speak again, to be expressive, which was also a way to inhabit the historic cities again, because you have in that era of the 70s, 80s, and of urban renaissance, this kind of Fordist moving out into the suburbs, greenfield factories, sleeping cities, 9 to 5 commuting. That reversed to some extent because you had a more dynamic economy with smaller startup companies and so on and so forth. So that was expressed in postmodernism as a new kind of era of societal, let's say, reproduction and innovation and so on. And you get these small incisions, and then to some extent it explains the affiliation with historical motifs, but it was also just grabbing onto anything to have something more expressive. And complexity and contradiction was an early manifesto. And then learning from Las Vegas as well about the semiological dimension into architecture. So I appreciate this. And I thought that deconstructivism. I learned about postmodernism at university in the early 80s and the mid-80s, and my heart wasn't interested. I wasn't kind of understanding yet its purpose and rationality. But when I came to London, I was part of this kind of, before I went to Zaha, even this guy like Kevin Robert, and we looked at the new spirit in architecture, which was deconstructivism, which I had more time for. I thought that the postmodernism was a bit cute. I don't like humor in architecture, and this kind of pop play with motifs. I wasn't into it myself, but I realized when you look at Charles Jenks's the language of postmodern architecture, he's talking about postmodern space. A lot of the features of deconstructivism, for instance, interpenetrating of spaces, this kind of idea of collaging, was anticipated in postmodernism, became prevalent in deconstructivism, but without the kind of historicizing motifs, but instead with more abstract geometric elements, and the kind of recycling to some extent constructivism, suprematism, etc., which Zaha was into, and deconstructivism. Therefore, if you look at Parc de la Villette, there was some kind of retro-constructivism, if you like. But there was also the attempt to be more original and fresh, and not actually explicitly. It was implicitly neo-constructivism, but it wanted to be something unique and contemporary and new, and wasn't retro explicitly in its consciousness. So I tried to do the complexity game and collage game, and without the kind of historical motifs, and therefore it is less constrained, let's say, by traditional typologies, because postmodernism had this element where it also went into neo, like the Krier brothers, for instance. They went into neoclassicism and really treasuring the old towns and cities. And there were other postmodernists like Eisenman who just thought it was more like a pop art style play, collage. And there were quite different sensibilities. And, my sensibilities were more with the Eisenman, and even OMA were in the postmodern play.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And they were actually, there was a certain retro 50s thing. If you look at the dance theater, The Hague and so on. And he was part of the 1980 show La Strada Novitas, whatever it was called, at the Biennale, which was, the idea of going back to a traditional street and having buildings, the emphasis on the facade addressing the street, and then each building being different. That is, there you see the kind of, there's a traditionalism element, at the same time there's a kind of pop element, because a lot of these postmodern things I've had were, very funny colors and collaging, and they were mannerists in a sense, or eclecticism. just a different era. Manierism was originally the transition from Renaissance to Baroque, but it has similar connotations. And then eclecticism was the late 19th century, the end of historicism. And these elements, this kind of very playful engagement with the motifs of traditional architecture in pop colors and against not using literally the grammars of traditional architecture. That was the progressive element. And then there were also aggressive elements in what Jenks called postmodern space. He actually was Eisenman's intersecting grids, or these kind of layers of punch-through sheets which generated space. So it were quite original features, which Kahn had started a little bit and was exactly. So I think there was a lot in postmodernism which was progressive. And the progressive element were recuperated in deconstructivism and radicalized in deconstructivism. And the regressive elements, let's say the traditional element, they mutated into this kind of popular cutesy town, which also then, Graves was one of those guys who became too popular for his own good, because originally it was quite kind of radical.
But can I just stop you there and ask why? I mean, just as a point of reference, you describe here what's progressive and what's regressive. Why would you describe something that has a kind of traditional, let's say, tectonics as regressive?
Well, let's say if it's just going back to, look, there's even one element to relativize a little bit, where I thought this book, Urban Space, by Rob Creer, had things to say. So this emphasis on the void space, the urban void and the figural void. Also in Conor Rowe you have some of that. Looking at the Nolly plan and so on. And to criticize this kind of vastness of indifferent, free-flowing space as an amorphous between object buildings. That element I accept. But you can get at this without the motifs, without the literal recuperation of everything about the traditional town. So that element I do think is progressive. Let's say, progressive, regressive is something which leads forward and can be rationally appropriated and argued, and regressive something which is maybe more motivated by an emotional engagement or nostalgia, or by the uncertainty to filter out the elements. So sometimes it's okay because I don't know, somehow these traditional towns are successful. They are, people like them, and they seem to generate some urbanity, which the new satellite cities don't have. And I don't know why. So I go lock, stock, and barrel, just trying to replicate it because I can filter out the factors, irrelevant factors from, and that leads to this. But I call it regressive because it's just not analytic penetrating the issues, and is guided by kind of lock, stock, and barrel kind of holistic, gobbling up of some kind of old thing. And why? Well, that is regressive because it's not leading us. There was a reason why we moved out of, why cities transformed and not stayed like, Siena or whatever these models were of the traditional historic cities.
But funnily, Siena is much closer to parametricism than, let's say, New Belgrade or a kind of modernist.
Except in part of parametricism, let's say, learning from the vernaculars in terms of, because there was this kind of more bottom-up, accumulative build-up, trial and error, and more adaptive variation in adaptive capacity, because each problem was solved contingently in this location, based, of course, on models. So yes, you can say that, but still, you will not see us literally, replicating lock, stock, and barrel and traditional town. And also atmospherically, I think it's wrong. I sometimes find it wrong, even though they work, inverted commas, atmospherically is also something. I want to have something which signals 21st century, incites me to understand that we're in a different era, we have new problems. If you go study, for instance, if you study philosophy in Cambridge, in the medieval kind of colleges, or even in a replica like Yale, this kind of neo-Gothic replica.
With a few Stalin towers here and there.
With the only exception there being the architecture building, the Rudolph building, which I find kind of strong. You know, it has a wonderful kind of open section and atrium, so it has things which point beyond the typical modernist kind of building. So I feel that is atmospherically also stale. So if you go to Cambridge, and I mean it's maybe a cliche, but your mood is different. You know, you want to study theology, or you want to study Plato and Aristotle. You don't want to study, you know, second order cybernetics. You see what I mean? But if the university would look like the Centre Pompidou, you want to study, you know.
Well, Patrick, we're going somewhere tricky. Then in a Georgian terrace, you find DRL.
Look, this is a tangential, not the core of the argument.
Yeah.
That's a little bit of a hint, but it's not totally relevant because it collects people. So people also, so I'm criticizing this kind of nostalgic, intuitive way of selecting.
Mm-hmm.
But we can't dismiss it. We all navigate all together. We all navigate the world aesthetically, and we can't always analyze the particular structures. Let's say there's space syntax argument for the historic cities. Right, and there's for analytical arguments about optimized detour system in the medieval town. So you could, that's what we should build on, and then we could recuperate relevant aspects. But if we're not going to be around and do a space analysis before we visit this or that district, or before we locate our home or office space. Maybe we should, but we usually don't. We go more intuitively. And on the intuitive things, we're selecting something which, according to our aesthetic sensibility, what we're looking out for. And so we have to reckon with that. So we don't only have to kind of generate the objective conditions, we also have to kind of signal atmospherically. And oftentimes this helps, for instance, with our buildings. Let's say we have a kind of office building, like in Moscow. It's a very cool thing, and you have also a lot of communication space. So objectively, you can kind of form a co-location synergies there, but it kind of somehow attracts companies who have a certain contemporaneous outlook, relatively young people. They have a certain, so they find each other there because they're on the same page, and that is something which architecture does. And you'll find, another group of people. They find each other because they all love this kind of dark traditional pubs with a traditional whatever passion pie and so on. So these some of these kind of superficial markers, they also help sorting. So we shouldn't be altogether oblivious to them, these aesthetic markers.
I mean, there's a couple of strands going from here. I think firstly, maybe I don't want to leave this without discussion, but I wonder what's the problem with fun? Why are you so serious?
I don't like humor. Oh gosh, yeah, no. Well, I don't know. I don't want to leave in a joke. I mean, I understand a kindergarten, maybe, or an entertainment place and so on, but I never understood this kind of my own house full of ironies and citations like Charles Jenks. I wouldn't want to live like that. Or an office building, a university. I mean, to have some kind of jokes like Van Gehry sometimes, the binoculars or something, inflated like a Claes Oldenburg kind of inflated this or that. I don't know. I think it's something which is there's nothing wrong with fun, but certain institutions and buildings have purposes and we want to maybe articulate those and the different parts and make it legible, and then we use form for that. And we don't use the form to crack a joke.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Is there something in attitude towards a profession? I mean, architects like OMA, they're famously a bit cynical.
Yeah, I know. So that I find not appropriate, quite frankly, yes. I mean, Rem has this, he's a less serious person. I think he did a lot of wonderful research and great writings and slogans, Delirious New York, but of course, Bigness, and some of these articles in SMRX, and I have a lot of respect for them, but he is after what he's after. He's more of an agent provocateur. He's after making, rubbing the discipline the wrong way. I think there are insights there, don't get me wrong, but he's too much in love with some of these slogans he then coins and puts a little copyright. This is itself partly ironic, and there's no coherent red thread. It's always something against the grain, something which hasn't been discovered yet. Bring something up, but he's not a system builder, not a kind of leader who knows the way forward. He's just some journalistic mind of teasing out tendencies. I mean, I learned a lot. I mean, don't get me wrong. I think some of these, the way the actual dynamics of urban development are going against the grain of a canon of academic architecture. I mean, that's very good. But he has that, he sometimes surrealist kind of provocations he wants to put forward in a building, and sometimes it makes sense. I mean, when you wanted to put escalator, I wanted to make MoMA look like a shopping mall. So there's a kind of critic. It fits with kind of commodification of art discourse. Sometimes it might be appropriate, but usually I think I want to take life more seriously, and institutions we're designing for, and I don't think it's inappropriate gesture.
I'm wondering what you make of Cedric Price, for example, who had that element of fun in his or element of cynicism, but was so deeply committed to working ideas through. I wonder if you ever thought or engaged.
Yeah, I met him. I was around when he was still there, and I met him a few times and saw him around and so on and so forth. And some lectures, I saw some lectures he gave. And I have a respect for his work, for his also collaboration with Gordon Pask, and I learned about him and Glenville and that whole circle. I was aware of some of his projects, and I was a great fan of Archidram too. I mean, I thought it was very progressive. It was good over the top as well. I mean, but there was an exuberance there and an exaggeration, but I thought these were kind of quite stimulating. I actually wrote a book about Archidram as a young man in my 20s, and he was part of that, obviously, a big influence and so on and so forth. So I don't see. Yes, he was funny and humorous. He had a cigar and the big belly and the whiskey, and he was a bit of a drunk. Partly, like Gordon Pask, tragically also. And I mean, I don't know, maybe there was some kind of frustration. I mean, it was late in his career that he didn't pull through, he didn't do much. I mean, he was provocateur, but where are the big writings, where are the big buildings, where are the big influence? So so maybe there was a bit of kind of a cynicism in the end of let's say exaggerated, failed life, maybe. For this, he's bright man, ends up in kind of semi-alcoholic, kind of hanging around with kids and didn't achieve much. OMA it's quite a different achievement,
Or achievement.
I mean, there's something really bigger. So he's somebody you could take much more seriously. His writings are more extensive, and he has a big body of work and created all these kind of spin-offs. Kind of 10 great spin-offs of OMA. He couldn't keep them all together and was on the show. And Régnier is a kind of reincarnation of Rem things. I mean, Rem is still there, of course. Also with this kind of irony, never propositional, always undercutting everything. So the attitude is different. Now finally, actually, Régnier is coming out with his positive manifesto, because I've been teasing with and challenging him a number of times. then he's always kind of taking the piss and undercutting and exposing irrationalities and false starts and false ideologies, and saying, what is your ideology? Mm-hmm. And I think you have to come to that. Otherwise, and I do find that Rem has, and Renier up to this point, let's see a piece, I haven't seen this book, mm-hmm. If he's really having something positive manifesto, I don't think you can, by the way, generate this within a couple of years through a book. So I remain skeptical. But there, yes, I'm much more serious than these guys. And I thought, so Rem, I don't think he's unserious. Of course, I wouldn't say that. And he has fantastic innovations like what he's done with Bibliothèque Nationale and bigness and this kind of space of deep, free space, unleashing a regime of complexity. It was part of the complexity discourse. But ultimately, he kind of sways. Just because he was pushing metropolitan life and density and urbanization so much, then suddenly said, okay, he's getting bored and now I'm going to the countryside. Mm-hmm. It makes sense to him. There's nothing to do in the countryside. And then finding some fascination with big data centers and so on. I think this is relevant stuff. So he doesn't have a clear compass about the role of architecture in society and where society is going. I feel he's this kind of remains a very smart and resourceful engin provocateur, but he could have switched topic, because there's another kind of, from the greater China, kind of around Hong Kong, the greater Bay Area, to Atlanta, mm-hmm. to shopping, Lagos, phenomena. Mm-hmm. Discovering phenomena which are intriguing, which our disciplines just can't handle, mm-hmm. and seems to be kind of incapable of engaging with. Mm-hmm. So that was quite productive. But there's the red thread is more kind of he's surfing the waves and discovering the processes. It's not bad, but he doesn't have a position. He then just kind of, maybe he's kind of aestheticizing and conceptualizing something like this. Mm-hmm. He finds out there, and then, it's a bit like Deleuze, New York, and the Manifesto, or something like the Manifesto of Bigness, is something which he discovers and then wants to extrapolate from. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a good method, and in a way modernism emerges as well, looking at industrialization, looking at factories and big infrastructures. So I'm not saying it's altogether a bad heuristic, but I don't feel it's pulling through.
But there's something that a really resourceful architect called Bart Prince, you probably haven't heard, no? Based in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Oh. In a very isolated, actually, there, and produces work that I should show you is incredibly unique. Kind of not really referenced, but he does have that. The lineage does link him in a way to Frank Lloyd Wright, and he told me in a conversation recently how he would sit or talk to Bruce Goff, who was his direct predecessor, who would say how Frank Lloyd Wright would demand things to be shown to him. So he would say, "Show me what you think." Okay. Not necessarily tell me what you think. Okay. And so I wonder whether there is something in your architecture, or in the architecture of these couple of people that we've referenced here, that, if all of your writing burned, we would be able to tell what you think or what you thought, in that spirit of show it to me.
Look, I do find some of that, what I'm thinking, being realized in our works. So, some of the urban plans we generated, and they've been building out like for 25 years. The Singapore One North master plan is a kind of knowledge economy hub, which works very well. Integrated city fabric. So I'm proud of that, and a lot of our buildings, not just like Maxi, but also recent projects, like the Dongdaemun, Haide Elief, and many others, cultural buildings, but also mixed use complex like the Galaxy project in Beijing. I think I use them in the lecture. So the good thing it's not divorced from, I can illustrate what I'm talking about. And also the recent work of tectonism. I can illustrate a lot of our works, as well as other firms and studios and research groups' works. And that remains, and that's imprinted But of course, a lot of this doesn't come through fully. Even on the semiological project, which is difficult to bring in and bring through, I can select together and use our work to illustrate some of that. But then it's better to illustrate it through DL works. These are unbuilt projects. So there I have more time and more thematic focus to develop these projects. For instance, on the semiological projects, on the phenomenological projects, on the, let's say, responsive environments and interactive, let's say, intelligent environment concept, they don't appear in reality yet. And it's very hard to make some of this, bring that into the real world. So there is, yes, I can show what I think, you know, and I'm continuously working on. For me, this is not just reflective, contemplative. This is all operational. And that's why I've done, you know, into the more difficult things, that's why I've done this PhD. I finished this 4 great PhD works who are thinking it through and demonstrating more in detail and also delivering its tool development at the same time. On some of the agent-based simulations, and now recently a kind of, let's say, legibility, navigability research. So there is stuff which is then this also illustrated. These theories are very conscious of this. They have to be have to grip and be operationalized in reality. And I have to kind of, I'm a little bit disillusioned that I realize I have to do them myself. And it's not just to write and then think that so many follow and build on this. I mean, but also I'm embedded in the movement. So parametism is a movement, even tectonism is a movement, and many other things. So I'm never isolated, but let's say I have a certain contribution which points beyond a certain take on this within the movement, and that's rarely being picked up. It's only Sergei Bouchard I can mention who's here in this company who's kind of more closely following and helping and working through and aligning with us and building on
a theoretical level.
On a theoretical into an execution level. And we're now working together also on an article recently and on a studio we're teaching together.
One thing we mentioned last time in a conversation, and I don't know if you remember, but there was a really interesting point when we got to this idea that perhaps a Marxist could have also ended up with parametricism as a formal response.
Well, I'm still a Marxist in the sense of historical materialism, the importance of technology and economics as the active part of history and drivers through competitiveness. And so I'm not a socialist. But at the time, the socialists, yes, they would also have gone parametricism because this is driven by there are certain illusions about some kind of libertarian socialism which could be compatible with illusions I had myself. The post-Fordism discourse was very important for me, and the recognition of all these kind of, let's say, debureaucratization, leveling of hierarchies, self-directed work, self-organization of teams and projects in clusters and networks of firms and projects. That is, it's emancipatory in many levels, and some of the left sensibilities would also endorse that, although they kind of see more the negative element, the precariat, and this is still self-exploitation now. I said, what do you prefer, self-exploitation? Or kind of somebody breathing down your neck and micromanaging you. And so there's a kind of tendency, because it's under the head, because socialist revolution hasn't happened, a lot of these tendencies are seen negatively, but they actually should be seen positively from a left-leaning, even particularly from an anarchist perspective. So the autonomia movement, out of which Deleuze and Guattari's Thousand Plateau evolves, they're kind of seeing similar tendencies there in the left discourse and left way of organizing struggles, the free flow and free circulation of struggles, the rejection of Leninist cadre parties and democratic centralism. This is similar to what happens in organization theory. It is similar with it connects up with cybernetics and with theories of self-organization and complexity and chaos theory and so it's interesting. This, you know, a lot of this came through the left theoreticians, and I don't see the huge break intellectually for me to jump on this and then later on go full on anarcho-capitalism. It's still anarcho, you know, instead of anarcho-communism, because anarcho-communism ultimately, you know, it's a delusion. I think the communism, the collective needs to, you know, then does it or does it not have power, and how does it have power, you know, and I don't think we need power so much. We need a free flow of initiatives and so on and so on, voluntary processes. So that's where I ended up. But there is a left version of that, which I was promoting. You know, even when I called it parametricism, it's the very moment I shifted into libertarianism. But that's just calling it parametricism. I was in the weeds of that movement and took a sociologically driven point of view from a left perspective.
But to what extent is parametricism offering countless possibilities? Because presumably that's part of the argument in relation to...
Well, yeah, absolutely. It is the repertoire, let's say, is much more expanded. And also the possibilities of manipulating and adapting, transforming, deforming according to information, delivering deformation and the elements, the variation and iteration and transformation of the fields and systems, and then the interaction between fields and systems. And there's much more variety and richness, like the endless forms of nature. You know, that will be inspiration. It's quite open-ended. I mean, it's just that it refuses and rejects some things where you say, well, that remains kind of inert, uninformed, indifferent. Let's say if you still place, I mean, I wouldn't exclude it in all. We recently worked with these big cubes, but let's say if you work with undifferentiated grids and hermetic volumes or Platonic primitives, and you leave them uninflected. You know, let's say we have a cube, like recently we carved them out and opening them up and so on, and the cube form is then still something which holds together a lot of internal complexity. But to just do a cube like the Mukab with a big cube with a singular central dome, which is an inflated version of this kind of Villa Rotonda or something. There's taboos against that, because it's not plausible that that you should incarcerate, inverted commas, or lock up an enormous amount of life process in such a preconceived form. So we have the infinite formal possibilities. We just exclude a few, you know, outmoded, ruthless, highly simplistic forms, which are not plausible, which cannot be the outcome, and will never be the outcome of a, let's say, self-organization process, for instance. Yeah.
But the possibilities are there in theory. They're not really there in practice. I mean, when you build a building, you've built a building.
Yeah, but
it's a pretty defined.
No, okay. So you mean once it's built, it's fixed, but
to a great extent.
Yeah, I mean that's understood. So we have to freeze that, and you have to tailor it to a situation, to a site, to an internal, let's say, process and institution. And then if the context changes and you've been affiliating to this, you know, then you could say it is undermined. But in my view, let's say if you build a building like this and into a context, and this is the ethos, it adjusts itself, it opens up because there's a plaza here, it connects up here because there's something in view, and the trajectory which injects itself into the building, all these contextual forces which you absorb and adapt to, motivate this building. And you can say, well, what happens if these things change? Well, they shouldn't just change randomly by somebody coming in and cutting a connection. If you had a proper discipline, yes, you would have to replace and you redo, but you would then still respect continuities.
Or you mean being in conversation?
You keep the conversation going and you keep the affiliations going, and it would make sense because whoever is buying that land or whoever is deciding to build on this land next to your building, probably your building being there is one of the reasons. And it's certainly, so as well as other things, but it's one of the contextual elements you choose to be next to. And there's a likelihood is that then you kind of pick up this axis or trajectory, or the new building also wants to keep the entrance opposite your entrance because they came to have relationships with you. That's my understanding. Could that be that there is a moment where they're coming for other reasons back here and it's a compromise? I can't exclude it. But no, my hope is that that this kind of game of affiliation, of relationship keeps being knitted, and this can be knitted and continued in different ways. Also, I do believe, for instance, if you had a city field and you have the default of making 100 blocks all different, and initially it relates to incoming streets and the topography, but then also a gradient where we're ordering the small, medium, large in a certain way, or we're mixing in small next to large, some kind of logic. And then institutions sort themselves into it. They find the smaller firms, find the small building, the larger find the large ones. The very big one is a community of smaller firms. And there's a kind of, if you had just a neutral grid, they had nothing to go by. It's random. I can go everywhere. They're all equal. If you structure something, then you go in and you will select and you will start sorting. And that could also happen a second time. That will continue even with substitutions. So the default of a variation, a varied but ordered varied, not a chaotically jumbled. Because chaotically jumbled, then it's difficult to find yourself, and it doesn't. There's more chance to have some kind of ordered, varied, what they call it, complex varied order, in a default field, which just has some of these gradients and differentiations, not random. It's when you actually have the functions to play with, you tailor it. But even if you didn't, you let society self-sort into it, and it keeps self-sorting into it, even though it keeps changing. That's my argument for that. And if the costs of that, or if it is not punitive, if it was kind of like in the 1950s, you would have a cost explosion if you deviate. If you made the 100 blocks the same versus 100 blocks different, you had a tripling of cost. Then that will be prohibitive, but we're not in that position. We're actually in a position, by the way, where accommodation costs for any enterprise are relatively trivial. Whatever we pay for, yes, it's not making much difference compared to salaries. It's nothing. It's a survey. Well, let's say it's the same.
Okay, we're entering the economic.
I mean,
yeah.
If it was double, it wouldn't kill us. It's like similar to what you pay for your software, your servers, and so on. And it's relatively small compared to, so it's always worth it to get in the good location and get better spaces. I think for most businesses, that's why we see in our buildings, very attractive buildings in the center of Hong Kong or in the Leadenhall Tower here in the city, just this wonderful frieze plates where he pulled out the core. Wonderful idea. We're copying places. They just can sell higher. They can sell it, and if they have an advantage, because in the end, for these financial firms, whatever they're paying there, I mean, they don't pay astronomical. We don't have to because there's still competition.
Well, there is an economy, yeah.
In the city, because there you don't have planning restrictions. So it's the same here. So I think the economics would be to to say it's always worth looking at the benefit side rather than the cost side. Of course, entrepreneurs have to look cost competitive, but all entrepreneurs face the surcharge over making something more varied, over making it repetitive. But the surcharge is not relevant for the end users. And so I think it's definitely a viable and meaningful thing, even if it's more of a kind of a new default rather than something super tailored.
Okay, since we're talking about the market
here,
since we're talking about the market, market is something that I very much associate with centrism. Somehow, well, I feel market pulls everything to a certain kind of center. It pulls Trump to a center. It pulls a socialist government to a center.
Political centrism.
Political centrism, yes. Because I think we're still talking in this realm of conviction or political position.
Yeah, I mean, look, certainly it disciplines. If you have, if you don't want to kill the market, and you want to have economic actors instead of total command and control economy, then you have to reckon with them being, voting with their feet, no longer investing or moving elsewhere. So yeah, there's this element. It constrains how much you can mess politically. So that it kind of limits the kind of your dreams of redesigning society. If you don't, but they're doing a lot of this redesigning, and they're going to the edge, I feel, in many ways, and it costs our prosperity. The problem is for entrepreneurs here, there's a lot of lock-in costs. We sometimes feel, we can't do anything here. We have nothing to do here. And we're paying an enormous amount of tax, and we feel constrained in terms of internal experimentation, let's say, with incentive schemes and all that. Why not we all decamp to Dubai? But you don't know how long that will last, but it's hard. We have too many people living and have kids at school or this and that, and university, AA. So it's difficult. So the government can mess around, and curb our flourishing, and we're still locked in here. But it's true, they can't go too far, and that's, if you like, this pulls thing, keeps things in a kind of semi-predictable, moderate kind of realm. I accept that. That's so for radical alternatives like your party, which I kind of looked at, and I actually went to some of their events.
Oh, you did?
Yeah. And they can only agree on, very kind of on Gaza, and they can agree on what to protest against. I don't think there's much chance they could agree on much when it comes to positive policy steps. So once they would take control, how far they would go, and how these nationalizations would unfold, and who would be empowered, they will fall apart in no time. So there's not been a discourse on this anyway. Well, but I do think that these characters, of course, they once you want to have more radical politics, you're running against market functioning, and that holds them back. Now, my position is quite radical and very pro-market, and allows the market to rip through and self-organize and go where it wants to go, with societal processes and entrepreneurship being totally unleashed. That's my world, but I'm saying markets and discourses. I'm not. My contribution to libertarianism is the overlooked importance of discourse.
But market is already organizing everything as what we have at the moment.
No, I don't. Absolutely, no. I don't think so. There's an enormous role of government, of regulation,
but market needs a degree of market needs a degree of predictability.
Yeah, but the large amount of political power, discretionary power, and that you could have an election as a new lot taking over, that's quite unpredictable. because you don't know who's going to win the election and you don't know what they end up doing. And they might come up with, shift over the levers. In China, you can feel that when they often make very abrupt, they have a lot of this political power. They just reset the framework and the rules. And that from one day to another, suddenly there's a price cap on all residences. Or from one day to another, there's, in particular in the urban development arena, they suddenly say, for instance, you can no longer buy in any of these larger cities if you're not a registered resident. That's sudden to cool off the market, but it kind of squashes the market at that point, and everybody has to kind of. And the market process themselves, when a tendency comes up, a new product, somebody is coming up with a new innovation. Yes, it could be so-called disruptive, but this is not as dramatic and rapid. And suddenly they switched the rules, and suddenly hundreds of projects are unviable. So I would say the market is dynamic, but it's more predictable than political action often.
I think maybe here we're actually probably talking a bit more about regulation. And you're clearly very interested in complete deregulation.
Absolutely.
But regulation is there because of the impact of, if you take something too far, you have monopolies that then control.
No, I don't think you would have the monopolies. So what I've learned, first of all, monopolies, the original monopolies were royal privileges. That was a typical, let's say, mafia structures, meaning
feudalist system,
feudal mafia, then absolutism, the royal prerogatives. There was this kind of controlling of who has a right to do this or that business, and with the guilds, and only if your father was a blacksmith, you could become a blacksmith. This was to keep, it was viable and reasonable because there wasn't much technological transformation and change. You didn't have to have suddenly more blacksmiths, so it was just politically controlling what anyway would have been relatively stable reproduction. Economic growth was 0.01% per decade or something for several hundred years under feudalism. So that was fine, but that is a typical thing. The characteristic situation is that you had political power regulating economic activity strictly throughout history, mostly, and where it wasn't through the formal authority, it was informal mafia structures. They're monopoly structures. So, but it requires kind of force. And in the 19th century, and let's say when you had kind of 18th, 19th century, you had kind of some kind of rule of law and framing the market. You didn't find spontaneous monopoly. There were attempts, of course, big businesses trying to monopolize. Nobody likes to be continuously exposed to competition.
But I think you're talking about elites here. I mean, elites emerge in every type of
point, which was the libertarians and particular anarcho-capitalists brought home. So the absolutism was still. They decided that because they also were kind of extracting. They granted royal privilege, a monopoly, to certain cities and businesses, and they were the only ones doing this kind of business, and then they kind of paid to the royal purse. And then later on, this was kind of criticized. This was this mercantilist system as well. They controlled trade. And the 19th century was more laissez-faire in France and in England. And then firms became larger and larger. There was concentration. This naturally, economies of scale. But when they tried the step into a monopoly was never reached. When you try to build these cartels and make agreements, you have to kind of regulate how much everybody is producing and keeping the price stable. They would always self-undermine. They make the agreements and then they go home and they start giving discounts to their friends. The official price was this, but so they were breaking up. It turned out that the monopoly isn't a spontaneous formation and is very difficult to organize. And they realized this was for several decades. It was attempted, and Rothbard is analyzing this. They were requiring the state to step in to help the cartelization, to give through licensing law, through certain interstate commerce commissions, through the railway commissions, where they controlled the price, where the government, because only the government has the monopoly of violence, they could then, if you undersell, the competitors could sue and get a lawsuit, and they would be slapped off, and that's the way they monopolized. Through government, and similar with the banking system, through central banks, the Federal Reserve, some kind of organizing the banks. They were competing with each other too much, so that they weren't inflating the money supply, which is very good for the banks. So they stepped collectively we cannot do it together. We don't undercut each other. So I refute monopoly. I do believe that in the current era in particular, I do admit that in the Fordist era, you had these big concentrated capital bureaucracies, corporate bureaucracies, assembly line, vertically integrated industries, a few firms. You could kind of lump them together and run them as a planned economy reasonably well. Not as good as separate. That was still useful to have a market and have some competition, but it was subdued. And you could look at this and the socialists saw it and say, well, there are now 3 or 4 steel companies. There's not much market activity. It's all vertically integrated. And we can actually nationalize them. We just substitute the owners, the shareholders. We become the government. That was reasonable to some extent. And you had nationalization of industries in Britain. You had the New Deal, quasi-nationalization and so on. This wasn't, and fascism. Fascist economies, the Krupps and all these families, but they couldn't determine prices, they couldn't determine investment, they couldn't determine production quota. That was all kind of state regulated. So the fascist economy is very similar to the also in Italy to the kind of socialist economy and to the New Deal kind of economy. They were all what we call state capitalism, or what then people call forms of state capitalism. And that model worked really was no longer working at all well since the 70s, 80s with the microeconomic revolutions. That's why communism collapsed. That's why Britain had to have a kind of Thatcher revolution. The US had a Reagan revolution. And my point is that this wasn't radical enough. These revolutions were reversed and were hemmed in, and kind of the gains they made were kind of redistributed and re-socialized through the next layer, like Clinton and Blair, and in Germany, and I mean, a lot of these countries, even Sweden and all the northern countries, they kind of remarketized. They had to give up their socialism because it's not competitive. It was inefficient, and they couldn't exploit the opportunities of this new world of microelectronic revolution. So, and I just feel we should experiment somewhere with a much more radical free market world in the advanced countries, not only in Argentina, which is so down the drain that the socialist kind of.
But what I struggle with in this rhetoric is that what we have now, I don't know if you would agree, is a system that, if you look at the share of the market of big tech companies in America, we have a feudal system, technically speaking.
Well, we have platform capitalism. I mean, I'm interested in that.
And you think if there was no regulation, we would actually get a much more equitable environment, and the gap between poor and rich would be smaller. Is that? Yeah, that's part of the argument.
No, of course. I mean, for instance, a lot of the these super high incomes in the financial sector, without the government, that wouldn't exist. First of all, there's a number of factors. As we always all know, they're kind of they collect in on the upside and then socialized the losses on the downside through bailouts, one time after another. That protects the financial industry people.
But billionaires are always getting richer. They will always get...
Yeah, they will always of government. All the first of all, for instance, deposit insurance means that, which is government organized and government guaranteed, and that people don't look after their income, where it's going. It just sits on a bank, and the banks compete on giving you high interest and not competing on prudence, because you don't have to worry about prudence. So that has a very kind of perverse incentive of how do you give more interest by taking more risks, and nobody is looking after your risk. Maybe some bureaucrats are supposed to be supervising, some kind of authorities, financial authorities, and they don't do their job in the same way millions of customers would do their job, the job of controlling and checking, and then you would have information flow and you would worry, because you would have to appraise, do I put my money where I get 3%, or should I put my money where it's 1%, and I know that they don't touch certain types of investments, certain types of lending practices. That doesn't exist because everybody is put to sleep. There's one aspect. There are many other aspects. The money printing. Whenever there's kind of problems in the economy, there's a kind of idea to suppress interest rates, to inflate assets back to where they were, to not worry anybody. This is very, very deficient. This is leading to crisis and leading also to people becoming more wealthy, because...
Well, absolutely. Lower interest rates, the money really is going to the billionaires.
Inflating, yeah. So without government, that wouldn't exist. So I would say on the tops, but on the other hand, some of course, capitalism, which I would defend, the billionaires, key figures, these self-made characters like, and let's say, if you look at Tesla, you could criticize that they got government loans,
big time,
and that they got government contracts.
Their biggest contracts are government
that's
contracts.
The bit. If you cut this out, there's only he's cut to half. Yeah. Well, but also on the other hand, if you look at these characters, that they're rich is also a misconception, in the sense when you can take their so-called net worth. What you really
well, they are rich in comparison to someone who's...
What I mean is you should look at
able to afford
You should look at consumption standards and what they're actually consuming. Warren Buffett,
I mean, Warren Buffett is not the best example.
Okay.
He's famously modest.
Musk or any of these
Bezos,
yeah. So yes, I don't know if he has a yacht, and some of the Apple guys had yachts. And yes, these are excessive things, or private jets which sit in the garage, and they have crews and so on. So, but still, that's only a small fraction of their so-called net worth. So these notions that these guys have kind of more wealth than country XYZ, that's disorienting, and it's kind of an exaggeration, because you should look at the consumption, what they're burning through their own consumption. And
but in an economy, they're accumulating.
Yeah, but but this wealth is invested. So that means it is invested in plants, in firms, in innovation and research projects, which working for you and me and everybody. The injustice is when you could say.
But you also, Patrick, you also know
is the five villas on houses with servants or cleaners he's maintaining, and that's the real. I would look. That's something one can kind of start criticizing, and this is always quite limited, and so it's a very, very small part. And the consumption standard of Elon Musk isn't necessarily very different of the consumption standard of Boris Johnson, or let's say Tony Blair.
But you know that the money that you say it's invested is actually a money that is a hole in a bank that we will all be bailing out once that
that's what I'm
thing
saying.
fails.
I don't want any bailouts. I want government altogether out. There's no corporate welfare, no corporate subsidies, no bailouts. no money printing, which is a kind of indirect bailout.
Well, it's something that we will all collectively pay. We will all collectively pay.
We pay through inflation.
And in the bailout.
So I'm absolutely against all of that. I call it crony capitalism. I call it state capitalism to the extent, and I'm very much against that.
Okay.
I wouldn't focus so I don't think the state coming in solving this. The state being in there is part of the problem. So if you would have a less of a problem, and I still believe that you have competition. Yes, it's harder. You have these network effects and you have winner takes all kind of dynamics.
Well, corruption as well.
Okay. I'm just saying that if you take the state out, which is purely the capitalist dynamics.
Yeah.
And I think to some extent, we have to accept and live with, in my view, with the fact, which is also a good incentive and a thrill, that if you are operating at a very sophisticated level with a lot of high energy and intelligence and innovation, and in the contemporary technological conditions, you can generate, for instance, a new app, a new product, a new system, and you can, other than in earlier periods, you can deliver that to billions of people around the world relatively rapidly. So your innovation is picked up and has these beneficiaries because they are making the choice. Great, that is worth my money. I pay money on this, on this. I'm happy that I can buy this. I want it, I love it, I need it, and it enhances me. And it might also enhance my productivity, but also fun in life and my connection, my sense of... So that means when you generate this innovation, which is a runaway success, and in the contemporary conditions could be just an app which everybody can download, billion in the most rapid adoption. And ChatGPT, how wonderful is this? I pay some subscription to I would pay 10 times. I would pay 10 times and still want it because it empowers me so much.
Yeah.
And in all the other things, it's now here in the office, everybody, X-Figura and all these.
But I think, Patrick,
what I want to come to is very important. That this, if I would be paying 5 times, 10 times, and other people making these choices, when you have innovation, you got super profits because the benefit you're generating.
I know,
so
but
much.
I need to stop you here.
Some of it flows back, but most of it is gifted freely. It's called consumer surplus.
Well, can I just stop you here? Okay. ChatGPT and all these amazing innovations are enabled by decades of government investment in education, in so many of these technologies have emerged at universities, in military spending, let's say, which of course is not the nicest way to spend money. But, you know, this is a military-grade weapon.
Wait, look. I've heard this argument, fair enough. I don't think that if...
It's not ChatGPT didn't just someone dreamt of it. And
let's say you have
and they made
the UK it. Or you have the America, they're taking 35%, and let's say took all the state tax and so on. All these advanced countries take about nearly 50% of GDP into their own wasted in the bureaucracy. Some of it they spend on research and development. Some of them they spend on infrastructure, which I think could have been done cheaper with the private sector. So I don't believe that it's kind of a forced saving. Some people argue. I think if this money was available in the private sector, state within the private sector, they also could have invested this in more research and development. Okay, it's counterfactual, I don't know.
Yeah.
And you could also say, well, I wish, they collecting all this, and to some extent, if you have cushy public sector job in universities, where you can come and go whenever you want, and you get promotion and tenure. It's not easy for private research.
It's not, no.
Outfit to compete with that. So there's kind of crowding out logics potentially.
Yeah, but I think also tenures don't guarantee good research, for sure.
Yeah, but that's the way the government generates research inefficiently. And once you have that, I mean, it's the same with welfare. I think welfare should be scrapped altogether because it's crowding out private systems which existed.
Okay,
which are much more efficient. Mutual aid societies, the good fellows, the friendly societies. 90% of urban working class was covered
Okay, because we're on record, let's not go there, because then I feel obliged to argue. But I'd rather ask you about what you made of the Venice Biennale last year.
Okay, better.
Because that gave us this kind of beautiful version of the world. You liked it?
I only liked the Arsenale.
The Arsenale. Okay, you didn't like the pavilions.
As usual, a total waste of time. All the pavilions. This time, I have to say, the last time there was still the Chinese pavilion. And this time the Chinese pavilion was also kind of semi-corrupted, even though it's a former student of mine, Mayan Sumo, did it.
But so you like this tech utopia in the Arsenale?
I did like the Arsenale, yeah. It's 100% tectonism, I love it.
But who's going to fund those amazing projects? Nuclear renaissance, where's the money going to come from?
Well, it's a good point. A lot of this was, partly publicly funded, partly kind of privately funded. In America, a lot of these are privately endowed. MIT, but then ETH is government funded. So you had a lot of these research teams and groups, and so I did like it. I mean, at least I was missing a bit of larger projects because tectonism, parametrism, tectonism, which was, and computational design and fabrication, we have real built examples of that. We don't only have to show, but they were inviting only the research outfits. I was happy they were there. I was happy that's something different than the prep, whatever, than let's say some kind of poverty crisis was discussed, which the huge problems, but not problems architecture can address. So the architecture the discourse, avant-garde discourse and the cultural discourse of architecture should worry about bringing the civilization forward and seeing the next stage and speculating and researching development. And for that, I was very happy with what Calorati put together. So I was quite thrilled because it was so kind of unhappy and depressed nearly about the state of the discipline from the previous 5 biennales. This was, the pavilions again was still a wipeout as far as I'm concerned.
I saw that you were about to make some, to present your treatise on education, let's say, at the AA as part of a couple of other topics that you would like to discuss.
Oh, yes.
I'm curious what you're going to say about architectural education there.
Well, I was talking research and education, and for me, that's something the universities has been very important as a kind of the research branch of architecture, avant-garde research. You have more time, you have a lot of young creators, energy, and so that's extremely important. I think for us also, I have to recognize and reflect, without all these collaborations and opportunities to teach in various universities, in the A in particular, we could not be who we are. There's no way. Because when you're in the trenches of a client coming through the door or competition mostly, and you have maximum 6 weeks, 8 weeks, you can't start a totally new agenda, do for the first time, now I want to do some kind of topology optimized skeleton, an exoskeleton building, or I want to do a kind of combination of tensile and shell structures, and or et cetera. So, or I want to do this kind of parametric urbanism. You couldn't do it. So we literally several years of thinking, testing, illustrating, working, building up skills, building up thinking, concepts, that to get something ready for trying it in the competition. And then also not only and then having that thought through and applying that. So that's extremely important. And education, well, I have this apprenticeship model, which I once articulated in an article. I mean, it sounds just a bit slightly provocative, but rather than presuming that so I have, first of all, it's a taught course, so you should come in and give a kind of download of what you've learned, what you think, but also what the discipline has achieved. You have to bring people into the discipline. And that not happen often enough because there's the lack of competency in the teachers, or I mean, I'm not doing it as much as I used to for time reasons. I had all my seminar series and so on, bring them into the fold, and then invite them to collaborate on a project. I mean, the project is, they're working in teams, and the whole studio is working on a theme which is set by the teacher. I mean, that's normal, but I'm quite determined, I'm quite strategic by now, maybe a more kind of open-ended 30 years ago, but much more clear about what we could achieve, where we want to go. There's precedents, and there's parallel experiments, and there's an outlook that this has legs into the future. So I'm guiding it quite strongly. So in this sense, the student becomes a kind of creative collaborator. Apprentice may be a wrong word, but I'm not saying I want to let you discover what you think is most interesting and important in architecture. It's a kind of thesis approach, and I'm just your interlocutor. I'm just asking questions. You find yourself, you find your area, and so on. I'm not teaching like this, and I think it's overburdening probably somebody. Most students. I mean, it's not the very strong characters who have that. You discover very quickly that they don't want to follow you, that they go against the grain. They have their own thing. Usually, it's good enough. I can give them a critique. I had some of students like this, and they're on a tangent, and they let this happen. But usually, of course, they can't quite. The result's not going to be quite so compelling.
But what's good about DRL is that you meet on kind of agreed terms to an extent. They know what they've signed up when they come to DRL. And I think that's a really amazing, privileged position to be in, because then you are part of a conversation that's already has certain parameters. I wonder what you think about kind of function of education more broadly. I mean, we see such polarity. Last time we spoke, you said it's not time for plurality. Last time we spoke,
I feel there's a certain problem with what frustrates me is that we have this fragmentation of discipline, and that there's so many distractions, and it could become not even kind of focused in the discipline, because it's nearly like an art school where in an art school I accept that there's no such thing as art, except it's engaging with the world in whatever means, provocatively. It's picking up any technology. It is unconstrained. It's an open-ended field. It shouldn't maybe even exist as university. It doesn't make much sense. But architecture is a discipline. It has a certain societal task. It has to innovate the built environment on a number of levels, on an urban scale, on an architectural scale. And there are certain things, certain sets of knowledges and expertises you should learn. And so you need to be kind of initiated into it. And I think there's something where there's no curriculum, or a very kind of fragmented one, and there's a lack of convergence in the field, which particular said that in the educational field. I mean, we did have convergence in the 1990s and into the 2000s, where I thought all the universities and all the places I was teaching, particularly elite universities, were converging on a set of conversations, on a set of tools, on a set of agendas,
on a certain canon as well.
Canon, and as also things were connected. The units were talking and trying something similar, directly comparing. And at the time, also the field was not so closed. I mean, you could still enter competition.
Well, for young practices especially.
Easier. Well, he benefited.
Well, yeah, of course.
And now it's much more closed. You feel distant from that. You just get you need to generate some kind of frustration and aggression. After 2008, there was also not only so many opportunities anymore.
It is
in China. You had a more of a track record there at that stage, not early on, and the whole Dubai, whole of Europe stuff. So I think so I know what it looks like if you have the excitement of convergence and sharing certain knowledges and skills, and everybody reading key texts and key protagonists, and rather than being being part of a movement that should, I wish we were still had continued in this realm.
I guess the point is that some of those canons actually probably need to be rethought in the context of what you know.
Yeah, but that means we need to discuss. I mean, there's not. It's things are too fragmented. If you look at the various agendas of the various units, they don't share many. They don't even share terminology. They don't share.
But this just brings me back, and maybe I know you have to go in a bit, but maybe just the final question is somewhere where we started, which is this idea of you contextualizing yourself in a movement.
Yeah.
And why it matters to be part of a movement?
Well, it matters to impact. You know, I feel that we don't impact the field. I love the story of the modernists. I love the modern movement and how they transformed the planet and the visionary of the built environment around the world, and how they had. I mean, this was a strong movement. This was something which converged, which started with some manifestos, with some exhibitions, with some small manifesto projects, and they took over. It became compelling. It was a good fit for that world since the 1920s, where you have an industrialized society and you have some kind of democracy established at the same time as well. There were precursors in the early 20th century. I mean, the fact, I'm just thinking often, you know, if you think about it, there's a book coming out, the invention of modern design in the age of monopoly capitalism. That last part was lopped off the title, but historical materialist analysis of the early Werkbund years. So it's my PhD thesis, and I looked at the origin intellectually and the theory of functionalism and functionally driven design came even before the 1920s. Otto Wagner, Hermann Cartesius, etc. people, and then at the Peter Behrens in his office, you had Le Corbusier working there, Mies van der Rohe working there, and Walter Gropius working in the same office. And these became the heroes. They built the Bauhaus. They had early projects, and in the 60s they could look back. They all, you know, between 1965 and 1969 or 70 or Gropius, they could look back, and the whole planet was remade in their image. And of course, there were other protagonists, and there were discussions, and it was deeply
linked to the technological.
That's what I like, and it was related to technology and transforming. And it was a movement, and it had a series of subsidiary styles, and it continued after that in the 70s through, you know, brutalism and high tech and so on. That's what I love, and this, because it is impactful. It changed the world for the better, changed cities for the better, and we wouldn't now want to live in this.
No. But the world is so much more multipolar
because
now.
It was so. We have a whole new era of, you know, the post-Fordist network society. So we don't I'm not going back to these recipes. I'm just thinking, I love that convergence. I love that theory-led discourse where in 1960 anybody could be India, Africa, South America. You had Brasilia and India. You had Chandigarh and you had Le Corbusier was the first big international architecture firm who could influence in the US. You had SOM, even already major corporate firms, and a grand bunch of at scale you could generate. And then you look at Mises' first building in Manhattan in the world of stone. You know, 30 years later, everything remade in the image, the skyline of Chicago. I mean, that's what inspires me. We should have this impact. Why not? Because we are not, it needs convergence, it needs a movement. That couldn't have been delivered by one isolated character.
I mean, this opens up so many questions of environmental sustainability, multipolar nature of the world that we have today.
Well, backwardness, unfortunately, still. And
so on and so on.
So, but I think that we have a world society, we have a world architecture, and these kind of, that you have some of these nationalist kind of ideas of going back to Chineseness, going back to Arabness, and when they ask you to do Salami style or Salmani style, these things should not happen. I mean, it will, if you go into a territory, you naturally, through materiality, through climatic, there will be affiliations, and if there's cultural patterns, which are, but so I think it should be in the global parametrism would be much more adaptive to local conditions, inherently more.
But you first need to win in an election that will choose parametricism as a next style.
No, we're not. Well, we need to just have an open discussion in the discipline, and people need to start see that we should collectively. That's why I'm saying markets and discourses. Discourses are extremely important. And this civilization was built on markets and discourses. The scientific revolution, the political theory revolution, jurisprudence, scholarly, legal discourse, all these aspects of society have discursive discourses, architectural theory discourse. Unfortunately, it's been totally swamped by wokeness and sustainability usurpation, and we're not talking much more deep about the morphologies and repertoires and methodologies. We need to deliver something, and that's what this is my pitch. So we need to converge, and if somebody, I'm very happy to be challenged about the answers, but to say, well, we don't have answers. Everybody does their own. We just convergence is totalitarian.